The research vessel Harmony drifted through space like a metal island in an ocean of endless twilight. Captain Lee stood at the observation deck, his hands clasped behind his back as he stared into the dim expanse that stretched beyond the reinforced windows. The stars looked sick here, their light choked and weak, struggling through the thick haze that had poisoned the galaxy for longer than human civilization had existed. 3,000 years. That's how long the darkness had ruled. "Captain, we're getting a message from the Vulcan Council," said Communications Officer Park. Her voice cut through the quiet hum of the ship's engines. She sat at her station, fingers moving quickly over the glowing controls that floated in the air before her. Lee turned away from the window and nodded. The Vulcans were like most of the alien races they had met during their journey through this sector. They had learned to live in the permanent dusk, building their cities with glowing plants and creatures that made their own light. It was beautiful, in its own way, but it wasn't natural. It wasn't right. Dr. Kim walked over from his science station, his old face showing the worry he felt inside. Kim had been studying alien worlds for most of his life, and what he found always made him sad. "Sir, I've been looking at the energy readings from their home planet. They get all their power from the Umbral Dominion's network. They've never seen real sunlight, not even once." The captain felt his jaw clench. Every single species they encountered told the same story. They spoke of the ancient Umbral Dominion, as if they were gods who had given them a gift. The Dominion had covered their suns with darkness, and then sold them controlled energy instead. The aliens called it a blessing. They said the old stories about burning bright stars were just fairy tales their primitive ancestors had made up. But humans knew better. Humans remembered what real sunlight felt like on their skin. Lee walked closer to the large window and pressed his palm against the cool metal frame. Out there, somewhere in the distance, was Earth, or what was left of it. The planet where his species had been born under a yellow star that burned bright and warm. That star was gone now, drained by the Dominion centuries ago, but humans had built a new one. They had refused to live in the darkness. "The Vulcans want to meet with us," Park said, still working at her station. "They're curious about our ship. They say they've never seen anything that makes its own light, like we do." Of course they hadn't. Most species had given up trying to make their own energy after the Dominion took their stars. They had become dependent, like children who never learned to walk because someone always carried them. Kim pulled up a holographic display that showed the Vulcan homeworld. It was a beautiful planet, covered in cities that glowed with soft blue and green light. Millions of Vulcans lived there, working and raising families in the artificial twilight. They had art and music and literature, but they had never seen a sunrise. They had never watched their shadows change as their sun moved across the sky. "Look at this," Kim said, pointing to the energy readings on his screen. "Their entire civilization runs on power that the Dominion gives them. If the Dominion decided to cut them off tomorrow, billions would die in the darkness." Lee felt a familiar anger rising in his chest. This was what the Dominion did. They didn't just take away the light. They made entire civilizations depend on them for survival. It was slavery disguised as help. "Sir, what should I tell the Vulcans?" Park asked. The captain thought for a moment. They could try to explain the truth, but would the Vulcans believe them? Most aliens thought humans were crazy for wanting bright light. They called it star sickness and treated it like a disease. Some even pitied humans for not being able to adapt to the comfortable darkness, like civilized species had. "Tell them, we'll meet with their representatives," Lee said finally. "But first, set course for the Sol Memorial System." Park looked surprised. "Sir, that's 3 days out of our way." "I know." Lee turned back to the window. "But before we talk to another species that's forgotten what sunlight looks like, I want to remind ourselves what we're fighting for." Dr. Kim nodded slowly. He understood. The Sol Memorial System was where Earth used to orbit before the Dominion drained their sun. Now there was a new star there, smaller and artificial, but burning bright and true. It was humanity's greatest achievement and their most important symbol. It proved that the darkness didn't have to win, as the Harmony changed course and began its journey toward the memorial system. None of the crew could have imagined what was coming. They thought they were just explorers, studying alien worlds and trying to understand how the galaxy had become so dark. They didn't know that soon they would become the spark that would ignite a rebellion across the stars. The ship hummed quietly as it traveled through the endless twilight, carrying its human crew toward a destiny none of them could foresee. Engineer Han felt sweat dripping down his face as he worked on the massive machine in front of him. His hands moved carefully over the controls, making tiny adjustments to the fusion core that would soon create something incredible. Deep inside the asteroid mining station, the air was hot and thick with the smell of metal and electricity. This wasn't just any machine he was building. This was humanity's greatest creation, a device that could make its own star. "Artificial star will be ready in 30 seconds, Han said into his communication device. His voice echoed through the metal corridors of the station. Through the thick windows of the station, Han could see the Rigel mining colony floating in space. It looked sad and empty, like a city of ghosts. The buildings were dark except for the weak glow of emergency lights. 2,000 years ago, this place had been bright and full of life. Then the Umbral Dominion came with their giant machines and sucked all the energy out of the sun. Now there was nothing left but a cold, dead rock where a star used to be. Commander Cho stood next to Ambassador Kong near the communication station. Both of them looked nervous. They were about to do something that had never been done before. They were going to give light back to a world that had forgotten what real sunlight looked like. "Remember," Cho said quietly to Kong, "the people down there think we're crazy. They think wanting bright light is like having a sickness." Kong nodded. He had dealt with many alien species during his career as a diplomat. Most of them couldn't understand why humans needed so much light to be happy. They had adapted to the darkness over thousands of years. To them, humans were the weird ones, who couldn't learn to live properly. Han finished his final check and stepped back from the machine. "Starting the artificial star now," he announced. The fusion core began to glow. At first, it was just a soft red light, like the coals in a dying fire. Then it grew brighter and brighter, changing from red to orange to yellow. The machine made a deep humming sound that Han could feel in his bones. This was the sound of a star being born. Suddenly, brilliant light exploded from the station like a sword cutting through butter. The artificial star burst to life with the power of a real sun. Light poured out in all directions, washing over the dark colony below. For the first time in 2 millennia, true daylight touched the Rigel system. Down on the colony, thousands of alien voices cried out at once. Some screamed in fear. Others made sounds of wonder and amazement. These creatures had never seen anything brighter than the dim glow of their artificial city lights. To them, this sudden burst of sunlight was like magic. "By the void," said a voice through the translation device. It was the Rigelian delegate, the leader of the colony. His voice was shaking. "Your star sickness burns so bright. How do you stand it?" Ambassador Kong stepped forward. He spoke in a calm, gentle voice, the way someone might talk to a frightened child. "It's not a sickness, friend. This is life. This is what your great-great-grandparents knew before the darkness came to your world." The Rigelian delegate didn't answer right away. Through the communication screen, Kong could see him covering his eyes with his hands, trying to block out the brilliant light. Other Rigelians were doing the same thing. Some had run inside their buildings to hide from the sun. But slowly, some of them began to come back outside. They stood in the light with their eyes closed, feeling something their bodies had forgotten how to recognize. Warmth. Real warmth, from a real star, not the cold artificial heat from their machines. I don't understand, the delegate said finally. The Dominion told us that the old stars were dangerous. They said the light would hurt us. The Dominion lied, Kong said simply. They wanted to control you. They took away your sun and then sold you weak energy in return. But you don't have to live that way anymore. Han watched from his station as more and more Rigelians came outside. Some of them were crying, others were laughing. Children who had never seen their own shadows were pointing and running around in circles. Amazed by the dark shapes that followed them, Commander Cho walked over to another communication device. Reports were coming in from all over human space. Other teams were doing the same thing they had just done here. Dead stars were being brought back to life. Colonies that had lived in darkness for thousands of years were seeing sunlight again. Sir, said one of the technicians, we're getting messages from 12 different systems. They all want to know how we made the star work again. Cho smiled. This was what they had hoped for. The galaxy was finally starting to pay attention to humanity. For too long, other species had thought humans were just another weak race that would eventually give up and accept the darkness like everyone else had. But humans were different. They remembered what it felt like to live under a bright sky. They remembered the feeling of warm sunlight on their faces. And they refused to let the Umbral Dominion take that away from them. As reports continued to flood in from across human territory, it became clear that something important was happening. The strange beings who refused to accept the night were changing everything. The enemy ships appeared out of nowhere, like nightmares stepping out of a bad dream. Captain Song stood on the bridge of her warship, watching in shock as the dark vessels seemed to twist and bend the space around them. These weren't normal ships made of metal and glass. They looked like they were carved from solid shadow, and they moved in ways that hurt to look at. Captain, enemy ships, coming fast. Toward New Busan Colony, shouted Tactical Officer Yoon from his station. His hands were shaking as he worked his controls. Song could hear the fear in his voice, and that scared her more than anything else. Yoon had been in dozens of battles, but he had never seen anything like this. Below them, New Busan Colony was having a celebration. Just 2 weeks ago, the human engineers had built a new artificial sun for the system. Families who had lived in darkness for their entire lives were finally seeing real daylight. Children were playing outside in the warm sunshine for the first time. Parents were teaching their kids what shadows were. Now all of that was about to end. The shadow ships moved like hunting wolves, surrounding the colony and the small fleet of human vessels that protected it. Song could see dozens of them, their dark holes seeming to absorb any light that touched them. They didn't fire weapons or launch missiles. They did something much worse. Captain, something's wrong with our fusion cores, Yoon said, his voice getting higher with panic. The power levels are dropping fast. The artificial sun is getting dimmer. Song looked out the window and saw that Yoon was right. Their beautiful, artificial star, which had been burning bright and golden just moments before, was now fading to a weak orange glow. It was like watching a candle slowly being blown out. How is that possible? Song asked. But even as she spoke, she could see the lights on her own ship starting to flicker. The bridge became darker, and she heard the low hum of the engines beginning to slow down. They're not attacking us, Dr. Shin said from the medical station. His face was pale as he stared at his readings. They're eating our energy. They're eating the light itself. Song had heard stories about the Umbral Dominion's shadow technology, but she had never imagined it could be this powerful. These ships weren't just stealing energy from their machines. They were somehow consuming light, heat, and power from everything around them. All ships, emergency scatter protocol, Song broadcast to the rest of the fleet. Her voice stayed calm, even though her heart was pounding. Protect the stellar generators at all costs. We cannot let them destroy the sun. But it was already too late. Song watched helplessly as the shadow ships surrounded the massive fusion generator that created their artificial star. The machine was as big as a small moon, but against the darkness of the enemy vessels, it looked tiny and helpless. One by one, the lights began going out. The artificial sun grew dimmer and dimmer until it was nothing more than a red ember floating in space. Then even that died, leaving the system in the cold darkness it had known for thousands of years, down on New Busan Colony. Millions of people who had just learned to love sunlight watched their new dawn die. Song could imagine children crying as their shadows disappeared. She could picture families running back into their homes, confused and frightened by the return of the endless night. "Captain, we're losing life support," Dr. Shin called out. His medical ship was drifting powerless, its engines dead. "They're not just taking our fuel, they're consuming everything. Heat, light, electricity. Even the emergency power cells are draining." Around the colony, human ships were shutting down one after another. Some tried to run, but the shadow vessels followed them, draining their power until they became lifeless metal coffins floating in space. Others tried to fight, but their weapons wouldn't work without energy to power them. Song felt her own ship growing colder as the life support systems failed. The air was getting thin, and she could see her breath coming out in small white puffs. In a few minutes, they would all be dead, frozen in the darkness of space. "All hands, abandon ship," she ordered. "Launch escape pods immediately." The evacuation was chaos. Hundreds of small escape pods shot out from the dying human ships like seeds from a dying flower. Some of them had enough power to reach the colony. Others would drift in space until their air ran out. As Song climbed into her own escape pod, she took one last look at the shadow fleet. The dark ships hung in space like hungry sharks, having consumed all the light and energy they could find. Soon they would move on to find another human colony to destroy. But Song made a promise to herself as her pod launched into the darkness. Humanity had been fighting against the night for hundreds of years. They had built artificial suns when their real star died. They had refused to give up even when the rest of the galaxy accepted the darkness. This defeat was painful, but it wasn't the end. Somewhere out there, other human colonies were still burning bright. Other artificial suns were still pushing back the night. The Umbral Dominion might have won this battle, but the war for light was just beginning. Admiral Zhang stood in front of the biggest machine humanity had ever built. The stellar forge was enormous, taking up most of the ship called the Dawnbreaker. It looked like a giant metal flower with hundreds of pipes and wires connecting to a central core that glowed with contained energy. This wasn't just a weapon or a tool. This was hope made real. "We have our target," said Navigator Im from her station. She was looking at a star map that showed a dark spot where a sun used to be. The Arcturus system. Their star died 800 years ago. Zhang nodded slowly. 800 years was a long time for a world to live in darkness. The 3 planets in that system had once been warm and bright, with billions of people living happy lives under their yellow sun. Then the Umbral Dominion came with their shadow machines and drained all the energy away. Now those planets were cold and dark, their people surviving on whatever artificial heat they could make. Captain Nam looked up from the command deck below. His team of engineers was working frantically at their stations, checking and double-checking every system. "We're ready to begin the stellar resurrection sequence," he announced. Zhang took a deep breath. They had tested this machine on smaller dead stars, but never on something as big as the Arcturus sun. If it worked, they would bring light back to billions of people. If it failed, they might destroy themselves and leave those worlds in darkness forever. "Do it," she ordered. The Dawnbreaker slowly moved toward the dead star. It looked like a giant black ball floating in space, cold and lifeless. Once, this star had burned bright enough to warm 3 entire worlds. Now, it was nothing more than a dark rock. The stellar forge began to charge up. Zhang could feel the ship vibrating as enormous amounts of energy built up in the machine. The core grew brighter and brighter until it was almost too bright to look at. Then, with a sound like thunder in space, the resurrection beam fired. The beam hit the dead star, and something amazing happened. Deep inside the cold, dark core, ancient fires that had been sleeping for centuries began to wake up. Nuclear fusion, the process that makes stars burn, started again. The dead star began to glow. At first, it was just a tiny red spot. Then the glow grew bigger and brighter, spreading across the surface of the star like fire catching on dry wood. The red became orange, then yellow, then brilliant white. Space itself seemed to shake as the star came back to life. Light exploded outward from the reborn sun like a wave of pure happiness. It traveled across the system at the speed of light, reaching the first planet in just a few minutes. For the first time in 8 centuries, real sunlight touched the surface of Arcturus Prime. Pilot O was monitoring the communication systems when it happened. Suddenly, every radio frequency in the system came alive with voices. Billions of people on the 3 planets were all talking at once in dozens of different languages that humans had never heard before. "What are they saying?" Jang asked. O worked quickly with the universal translator, trying to make sense of the flood of alien voices. Most of it was just noise. People crying and shouting and laughing, all at the same time. But one message came through, clearly repeated over and over in different languages. "The star lives again. Our star lives again." Jang felt tears in her eyes as she listened to the alien voices. These people had lived their entire lives in artificial twilight, never knowing what real sunlight felt like. Their great-grandparents had told them stories about the time when their world was warm and bright, but most of them thought those were just fairy tales. Now they knew the stories were real. The same thing was happening all across human space. Other stellar Ford ships were moving from system to system, bringing dead stars back to life. Each time they succeeded, entire civilizations that had forgotten about real sunlight were suddenly reminded of what they had lost. On a world called Kepler 7, people who had never seen their own shadows were dancing in the streets as their reborn sun cast clear, sharp shadows for the first time in 1,000 years. On New Centauri, children who had only known the dim glow of artificial lights were staring up at their sky in wonder, watching clouds that actually cast shadows on. The ground-out engineer Beak was smiling as she worked at her communication station. Messages were coming in from everywhere, so many that her equipment could barely keep up. "Admiral," she said, "we're getting requests for help from over 200 star systems. They all want their suns back." Some of the messages were from human colonies asking for protection from the shadow fleets, but most of them were from alien worlds, species that had lived under Dominion control for thousands of years. They had seen what humans were doing, bringing light back to dead systems, and they wanted the same thing for their own worlds. "The rebellion is spreading," Jang said quietly. "They're starting to remember what they lost." She was right. Across the galaxy, alien civilizations were beginning to wake up from their long sleep in the darkness. Ancient festivals celebrating the sun, which had been forbidden by the Dominion for millennia, were suddenly happening again. People were singing songs their ancestors had sung under bright skies. The galaxy was remembering what it meant to live in the light, and they wanted it back. The Umbral Nexus was the most terrifying thing Captain Rue had ever seen. It hung in space like a giant black spider, so dark that it seemed to eat the light. Around it, long shadowy arms stretched out from its center, reaching across the galaxy like the tentacles of some horrible monster. For 3,000 years, this machine had kept the entire galaxy in artificial darkness. Captain Rue stood on the bridge of the Star's End, the most powerful ship humanity had ever built. His hands were steady, but his heart was beating fast. Around him, his crew worked at their stations, making final checks on all the systems. Everyone knew what they were about to do. Everyone knew they weren't coming back. "Sir," said Weapons Officer Moon from her station. Her voice was calm, but Rue could see her hands shaking slightly. All stellar cores are running at maximum power. If we overload them all at the same time, we won't survive it, Rue said, finishing her sentence. But the explosion will destroy their shadow network across half the galaxy. The star's end wasn't just a warship. It was a flying star, powered by 7 fusion cores that burned as hot as real suns. If they overloaded all 7 cores at once, the explosion would be bigger than anything the galaxy had ever seen. It would be like crashing a star into the Nexus. Communications. Officer Bay looked up from her station. Captain, the Allied fleets are ready. 200 different species, all waiting for our signal. Through the windows of the bridge, Rue could see hundreds of ships floating in space around them. There were Vulcans with their glowing blue vessels, Rigilians in their crystal ships, Arcarians flying machines that looked like metal birds. There were species that humans had never met before, all united by one simple wish. They wanted to see their suns again. These alien races had lived in darkness for so long that most of them had forgotten what real sunlight looked like. But when humans started bringing dead stars back to life, something had awakened in their hearts. They remembered the old stories their grandparents used to tell about bright skies and warm days. They realized what they had lost when the Dominion took their suns away. Now they were here, ready to fight for the light. Begin final approach, Rue ordered. The star's end began moving toward the Nexus. As they got closer, Rue could see how massive the structure really was. It was bigger than a planet, made of some kind of dark metal that absorbed all light that touched it. Strange symbols were carved into its surface, glowing with a sick purple light. 2 minutes until impact, announced Navigator Jung. Rue walked around the bridge, looking at each member of his crew. These were good people, the best humanity had to offer. They could have been safe on Earth, living under their artificial sun, raising families, and growing old. Instead, they had volunteered for this mission. They had chosen to sacrifice their lives so that billions of other people could see the dawn. 1 minute until impact. The crew stood up from their stations and gathered in the center of the bridge. They held hands and closed their eyes. Rue thought about Earth, with its blue skies and white clouds. He remembered the feeling of real sunlight on his face when he was a child. He thought about all the worlds across the galaxy where children had never seen their own shadows. 30 seconds. The Nexus grew larger and larger in the windows until it filled their entire view. The star's end was flying directly toward the heart of the structure, where the main shadow generator was located. The 7 fusion cores were burning brighter than they had ever burned before, ready to release all their energy at once. 10 seconds. Drew closed his eyes and thought about his daughter back on Earth. Maybe someday she would live in a galaxy where every world had its own sun. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The star's end crashed into the Nexus with the force of a newborn star. The 7 fusion cores exploded all at once, releasing more energy than 100 suns. The explosion was so bright that it could be seen from halfway across the galaxy. The Nexus didn't just break apart. It shattered like glass, sending pieces flying in all directions. The shadow network that had kept the galaxy dark for 3,000 years suddenly stopped working. Ancient machines that had been sucking light out of stars for millennia broke down all at once. Across the galaxy, amazing things began to happen. On worlds where people had lived in darkness for their entire lives, the artificial twilight suddenly lifted. Real sunlight, which had been blocked for centuries, came streaming down from the sky. People who had never seen a sunrise stood in their doorways, crying with joy as they watched the horizon turn gold and orange and pink. Children, who had only known the dim glow of artificial lights, ran outside and discovered what shadows were. Parents tried to explain to them what they were seeing, even though many of the adults had never seen real sunlight either. On 10,000 worlds, beings who had forgotten what dawn looked like watched in wonder as their suns emerged from the artificial darkness that had hidden them for so long. Where the Nexus had been, a new star now burned in space. It was made from the remains of the star's end and her brave crew, a monument to humanity's greatest gift to the galaxy. The long night was finally over. The dawn had come, at last.